And thanks very much for joining us tonight. We're going to be talking about an issue that is on the minds of millions of people, and that is the need to rethink policing in America, the issue of criminal justice, the issue of institutional racism. And I am delighted to have with me a good friend of mine and somebody I think all of you know, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. I don't have to tell anybody that the American people are sick and tired, not just of police brutality, but of police murders. Right now, we are reeling from the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police. But as everybody knows, Mr. Floyd was just one of many, many African Americans who have been murdered by police in recent years. And the list of names is too long to go into right now. We'd be here, unfortunately, too long a period. But I think everybody remembers the cases of Eric Garner, of Sandra Bland, of Laquan McDonald, of Tamir Rice, of Alton Sterling, Breonna Taylor, Freddie Gray, Rakia Boyd, Walter Scott, and many, many, many others. And I just want to take a moment to applaud all of the hundreds of thousands of people who over the last several weeks have marched from coast to coast to demand an end to police murders, to demand an end to police brutality, and to demand an end to institutional racism. And as a result of that grassroots activism, we are seeing some movement, not enough, but we're seeing some movement in the United States Congress. And some of that movement is being led by the senator I'm going to introduce to you in a minute, along with Senator Kamala Harris of California. And Cory Booker and Kamala Harris just the other day introduced some very, very significant policing reform legislation. And to discuss that legislation, let me introduce the senator from New Jersey, Cory Booker. Cory, how you doing?
I'm good, Bernie. It's good to be on with you always. I feel like we have been together in the Senate, but we can't get too close to each other these days. So it's good to be sitting with you in my living room in my apartment. So, and thank you, man. I think you're right when you say this legislation doesn't go far enough. It's very narrowly tailored to address police misconduct and accountability. And it does a few key things. One is it just outright bans practices that have gotten people killed, no-knock warrants, chokeholds, racial, religious profiling. It does another thing which just says, hey, if you're a police officer and you do wrong, from the time of Rodney King, where I watched police officers who just clearly violated the law and not get convicted. And so it changes the standards with which officers who do wrong can be convicted in criminal court and civil court.
Cory, say a word about that. You're a Yale Law School graduate, right?
Yes, sir.
All right. I talk about the problems, the standards that currently exist and how you're proposed to change them.
So on the criminal side, to be subject to federal criminal prosecution, the standard is called a willfulness standard, which means that it's called mens rea, which means that the person has to intentionally be seeking to kill. Now that is hard to prove. It's a very high standard. Our bill lowers that to reckless disregard. So it doesn't mean that you have to get into the head of what the person was intending to do if they're acting in reckless disregard for someone's life. On the civil side, there's something that has evolved in American jurisprudence, which is ridiculous. That basically says that if you have something called qualified immunity, you're immune to civil suits. 1983 civil suits. This is from an 1871 civil law that during the time after Reconstruction, when blacks were being so terrorized by the KKK, they put in this law that gives these 1983 civil rights protections. And but the judges, as it goes on, it evolved in a sense that make it so hard that they have something called qualified immunity. Unless there's been some kind of misconduct that is exactly like this one, the person is immune. Justice Sotomayor called this giving police permission to shoot first and think later. And so for them to be liable for civil suit, we changed that qualified immunity as well. And so that means now police officers on the federal level can be subject to criminal and civil penalties when they do wrong. It's a major pillar. And then the final thing, Senator Sanders, and I'm pretty sure I've heard you talk about this in the past, just that we are a nation that doesn't even collect the information on police use of force or police misconduct. So you could have this shadowy reality where if you're an activist on the street, you have no idea what the practices of your police are. If you're the ACLU, it's hard for you to get at the pattern and practices of a police department. And so we create Sunshine as one of the best disinfectants. We force the reporting of really critical data. And remember, there's been times where you had a police officer get bounced out of a police department for misconduct, and they leave and go someplace else and just to get rehired. And so there's a lot that we're getting at here that's just wrong.
And I think, Cory, we also, for years, and you and I just talked about it a moment before we went on the air, are worried about tanks and heavy-duty military equipment being used by local police to almost enforce martial law in communities. Your legislation addresses that issue as well, does it not?
It absolutely does. This over militarization of our police with ordinances that can explosive ordinances being given to police. All of these things now that we're seeing Americans of all backgrounds getting hit with bullets, rubber bullets, and seeing what happens to people, being gassed by their own police. We are beginning to realize these are very dangerous things. But now imagine it even being bigger than this, the kind of tanks and stuff. So we say enough of that as well. So there are a lot of practices that should just stop. There's a lot of a lack of accountability that police should have to face. And finally, these are actors of the state. In other words, the police act for us. We should have a lot more visibility into what they're doing to be able to hold them to even greater levels of accountability. Bernie, this is what you're saying, which I think is so important for you to say, because in 1992, I'm at Stanford University. For 10 years, I've had awful experiences with police. I was big at 12, 13. I was over 6 feet tall, and quickly learned how the world would see me as a threat and a danger. And even though I'm at Stanford University, still being pulled over by police, guns drawn on me, all the way to just shopping in malls, I see what happens to Rodney King, captured on videotape, and then it's a not guilty verdict. And I remember that night I wrote a column in the newspaper, Stanford newspaper, called "Why I've Lost Control." And I remember being out in the streets marching. And if you had told that young kid, 22 years old, that almost 30 years later, we would still be having these exact same problems where we wouldn't seem to get a rise out of people until something's caught on videotape. But worse, Bernie, what you've been pointing out, what you and I both were pointing out when we were running around the country, is between 92 and now, our prison population has gone up close to 500% in America. That was the beginning of the era of mass incarceration. When we further criminalize our society, where now there's more Black people under criminal supervision, jail, prison, probation, or parole, than all the slaves in 1850, where we call ourselves the land of the free, but 1 out of every 4 incarcerated people on the planet Earth is here in America. 1 out of every.
I want to back us up a little bit.
Yeah.
To something that you said a minute ago, which I think is important. Everybody, well, hopefully everybody, is repelled and appalled by the police murdering somebody like George Floyd or many others. But what you were talking about, I think a moment ago, doesn't get enough discussion, and that is what it means to be a young Black male simply walking the streets of the United States, and how that impacts your entire sense of self how you behave out on the streets, the fear that you feel. So what you were just telling us, as somebody who was a student at Stanford University, right?
Yes.
You and bumped into police. Talk a little bit about your relationship to the police simply as a tall, young black male.
Well, first of all, I had parents that, and it's a sad thing that they worked really hard to make my brother and I prepared for the world of policing. And I still remember trying to joke when my parents sat me down before I got my license to try to walk me through what it would be like as a black person, and how deadly serious they were. And then very quickly, at 17, 18, 19, my brother and I would see, because we lived in a predominantly white community, how we would be followed and pulled over and have very tense moments where I was afraid. And back in those days, you come over the George Washington Bridge back to New Jersey, you be prepared. And again, I would know the drill. I know where I put my hands. But to be accused of stealing the car that I'm driving, to have guns pointed at you, these are things that are, hurtful to the psyche. And that's why when you're going in malls and you're getting mall security, and I mean, just all of these slights build up in your psyche.
And Cory, this I gather is the norm. This is not an unusual situation for young black men.
No, and I also wanted to get us out of this idea that this is often conscious racism. These are systems where this is baked into the systems. This is implicit racial bias, where you've had big city police chiefs admit, I'm walking down a street, black youths on one side of the street, white youths on the other side of the street, that the black youths are perceived to be more dangerous. And even in my city, in Newark, black mayor, majority black city council, we inherited a city when I became mayor with decades of challenges going back to the uprisings in the 60s. And we thought we were reforming things. It wasn't until we got the data drawn for us by the federal government that we saw that even in our city with black leadership, that this was still a big problem. And so to the idea that this is not, that these videotapes that we capture, as horrific as they are, that they're not deeply part and parcel of the everyday lives of African Americans. And for every name that we know that you read, there are so many that we don't know. That's the problem. And you see this with some of these issues never becoming even to our knowledge until somebody released a videotape.
Right.
And let me tell you, the Kerner report, I can go back to every generation. Martin Luther King, people forget this line from the I Have a Dream speech, where he spoke directly to police brutality in the I Have a Dream speech. Go back before that. You can go all the way back to slave catchers. That this has been a constant part of the reality of African Americans in this country. That is something that we have to say enough is enough and make real changes. And that's the last thing I want to say to you, Bernie, because even a bill like ours, which is necessary, Martin Luther King said, you can legislate, I can't legislate you to love me, but I can pass laws to stop you from lynching me. So we need to pass laws to make accountability. But when you broaden the scope, and I know we're going to get there, Bernie, but I just want to say, we know that we are a society that has suffered from a poverty of empathy, where we have decided we're going to treat mental illness, poverty, drug addiction with prisons, jails, and police.
All right, I wanted to get there.
Yeah.
I'm going to get there in a second. Let's go to Newark, New Jersey.
Yes, sir.
Okay, you were mayor there. What kind of experience did you have? I was a mayor too. I was a mayor in Burlington, Vermont. What was your experience with the police department there before you were elected mayor, during your term as mayor?
Well, we mentioned it before the camera started. There's a movie about my first run called Street Fight.
Which, by the way, guys, is a great movie. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. Street Fight, mayor's race in Newark, New Jersey.
It got beaten in the Academy Awards by March of the Penguins. But the filmmaker did an amazing job and shocked me on how he covered he captured police misconduct. And we were having police officers intimidating folks or painting over, pulling down signs. They were a force to be reckoned with in the election. And we had to do a lot to protect polling places and more. It was very, very hard scrabble coming up, and shows you how there could be, how abuses could happen within the realm of politics. And again, we see this today with the President of the United States, for walking not for some national security urgency, but for a photo op. He abuses our rights, our civil liberties, and the police themselves by ordering them to do things that are undermining our collective values and our rights. And so coming up in that system, this is why I say we started right away. We said, well, let's try to stop putting people in jail by creating youth courts and drug courts and veterans courts. Let's try to create prisoner reentry. We came with an agenda of reform, but even us, we realized this system was so baked that we had to focus more on changing it. And so the police have been used to crush people who are organizing unions. You know this, Bernie. Have been used to crush poverty. I was telling you about my significant other, Rosario, who was homeless as a youth. She was actually discovered when she was in a squad.
Tell everybody it's Rosario Dawson, one of the great actresses in America. And why this guy ended up with Rosario, I don't know. The lucky man, maybe his haircut, I don't know.
I don't know what it is. I just know who she endorsed for to be president of the United States.
Well, at least she had some good taste. All right.
Yes, she did. She did. She's a big Bernie Sanders fan. And but she has this amazing story of being discovered sitting on a stoop in an abandoned home, and she told me very emotionally about what it was like to be in your home and the fearing of the police coming as a tool of the state to evict homeless people who were squatting in buildings across the street. They brought a tank down. She said, watching a tank. These folks weren't threats, but they used this to forcibly. And by the way, the money that was just in that maneuver, the guy you and I were both mayors, that operation alone, in terms of what it might have cost to actually provide quality housing for people, is outrageous. And so we see this time and time again, the crushing of social movement. I can go through Stonewall, the uprisings at Stonewall for LGBT. I can show you how the police have often been used as a tool of the state to repress people who are poor, who are minorities, who are organizing labor.
Cory, let's tie in economic justice with racial justice. You mentioned earlier, I think the number is 1 out of 4 young male African Americans are within the criminal justice system. Is that roughly right?
Yes, that's roughly right. That's roughly right.
And just stop and think of it. That is an astronomical number. And I want people to consider that you have some young white kid who's 21 years of age in some white suburb, and you have some poor black kid in the inner city. You tell me who's going to end up in jail. We know the answer. And we know that we have more people in jail today than any other country on earth, disproportionately African American, Latino, and Native American. And when you talk about the criminalization of poverty, Cory, as you well know, something like 20% of the people behind bars today are behind bars because they can't afford bail. By definition, that's why they're behind bars. They cannot come up with the $500 for bail. How outrageous is that? All right, so talk for a moment about the relationship between poverty, bad schools, and criminal justice.
And it goes deeper because there's a direct relationship also between your political power. And you know this, Bernie. So they wrote in the late 1800s, they decided to write into law these things called felony disenfranchisement. There were literally debates. How do we keep black people from voting?
Right.
Is we criminalize them. This is not made up. These are in legislative debates around the turn of from the 1800s to the 1900s. this big effort to stop blacks from voting. We went from having blacks in Congress and blacks in the Senate around that time to a century until we saw blacks in the Senate again and blacks in the House of the Representatives from the South, because they criminalized blacks and then took away their voting rights. So you have some counties in America, Bernie, no exaggeration, 1 out of every 4 African Americans can't vote because of felony disenfranchisement. That's combined with poverty because, again, you were right. There's no difference between blacks and whites for using drugs. In fact, young white men have a little bit higher rates of dealing drugs than young black men. Talking as a guy who was at Yale and Stanford, I watched, you named the drug, I probably saw it. And there's no fear there of people getting caught. But an African American is almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for these things, even though their usage rates are not. So now you get a nonviolent drug charge for doing something 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing. And now you have 40,000 collateral consequences that strip you from your economic power. Can't get Pell Grants, can't get public housing, can't get jobs, can't get loans from the banks. The ABA is identified. So you're literally, Villanova University did a study, there'd be 20% less poverty in America if our incarceration rates were the same as our European peers. And so by over-incarcerating black and brown people, you are subjugating, you're devastating them economically and the economic power. Today, Bernie, I had a strong conversation with the Secretary of Treasury and the Small Business Committee about why are you denying those PPP loans to anybody who's had a conviction within the last 5 years? It's absurd. You're an entrepreneur, you have a business, it's crushed. Every other business can get some help, but you're excluded. And so this idea of poverty being heaped upon it, this is why you and I talk about marijuana justice all the time. I'm very angry. I'm all for legalization. I came to the Senate and started speaking about legalization. But to say that in the same breath and not to include expunging records, reinvesting profits into communities that have been economically devastated by the drug war, you're not talking about justice if you suddenly say, okay, everybody start from the same field, go ahead. All these big companies, pharmaceutical companies, others are getting into the marijuana business. Blacks can't even qualify, many states can't even qualify for a license because they have nonviolent drug charges. So all of these issues, you're stripping people of their political power, of their economic power by over-criminalizing a population. And then, Bernie, I just want to say one thing about what happens when they go into prison. Because we do things that other countries and psychological professionals call torture. America tortures children in prisons when they put them in solitary confinement. Khalif Browder is a kid that I think it was Jay-Z helped to get a documentary made about his life. He was in prison for almost 2 years for stealing a backpack because, as you said, couldn't get out before trial because he couldn't make bail. 2 years stealing a backpack, put in solitary confinement. It so affected him psychologically, he eventually committed suicide. Well, your chances of committing suicide go way up if you're a child that's put into solitary confinement.
Well, not to mention, Cory, and we don't talk about this at all, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in jail are now dead as a result of the coronavirus. Many, many hundreds of people. So people get sent away for a nonviolent crime, they end up dying because there's no social distances, there's no protection for them in jail. And I know that you are aware, and again, we don't talk about this anywhere near enough, but there are prisons in this country, often Alabama, South Carolina, that are really, I mean, you're talking about 19th century barbarity, where people are killed, people are raped. It is unbelievably horrific. This is going on in America right now in the year 2020.
And it's not even the South. I mean, this incident in New York I think it was last winter, where the heat went out and they were living in unbelievable conditions with no sense of urgency to fix what's going on. And our women in prison, Bernie, and this is where I confess, I've been visiting prisons since I was in law school. I think every American should visit prisons and see what is being done in our name. But I never visited a women's prison, Bernie, until I became a senator. And the first time I went in, I knew that there was a high level, most of the women we incarcerate, most of them, about 80 to 90%, are survivors of sexual trauma. They've been raped and are survivors of that kind of horrors. They're put in these environments where the guards do not have trauma-informed care. They're walking in on them when they're undressed or going to the bathroom, compounding trauma, compounding mental illness. When I got to this prison, I was supposed to get a tour. I just ended up sitting with the women and then telling me stories of making tampons because they had to make a choice. Do I buy tampons? There's no menstrual equity ideals there. Do I buy tampons, or do I save my money to talk to my children? Because we charge usury rates to communicate with our kids. We shackle pregnant women in prisons. We still shackle pregnant women down when they're giving birth. And back to what you said with COVID, there was a woman, if I remember her name right, Miss Baird, and forgive me if I'm getting that wrong, who pregnant in prison, nonviolent drug offense, slips into unconsciousness on a respirator, gives birth while on the respirator, and then dies. She should be home with her child right now because we left people in there. We see privileged people getting out. Friends of the president.
I want to detour this discussion a little bit, Cory. I hope and believe that as a result of the murder of George Floyd, we are talking in this nation not only about rethinking police and police brutality, but we're rethinking the concept of justice.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to throw this out to you, and you tell me what you think. Some guy walks in, doesn't have any money, is poor, has a gun, walks into a 7-Eleven, robs the store, kills somebody in the process, guilty, goes to jail. Fine. Somebody runs a pharmaceutical company and colludes with other pharmaceutical companies to charge outrageously high prices for a drug that people need, insulin, other drugs. People die because they cannot afford the medicine they need. And that's true. People dying all over the country, getting much sicker. Is that person a murderer? How do we look at that person as opposed to somebody who walks into a store with a gun?
We have two different justice systems, Bernie.
Right.
We really do. Brian Stevenson says that we have a justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent.
Does anybody doubt that?
Nobody doubts that. Nobody would say, in fact, the death penalty, we've done longitudinal analysis. You're black and you kill somebody who's white and you're poor, you're going to get your chance of getting the death penalty are 3, 4, 5 times higher than someone who's in the reverse status. We have this.
Rich white people get electrocuted?
Don't get the death penalty.
No.
Don't get the death penalty. And we've seen this horrors that what your nonviolent drug crime versus, let's go back to those pharmaceutical executives, costing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of damage.
Right.
You're a young kid, and we know this is done. It's called stacking. There's a whole great book, Bernie, written, Why Innocent People Plead Guilty. Why has our criminal justice system shifted from courts and juries to now 98% of our criminal convictions are done by plea bargains? And the word bargain is a lie. There's no bargaining when you don't have equal power.
And by the way, for many of these people, they have virtually no legal defense, no attorneys, etc.
And even people who are, really these folks who are angels, who are public defenders, will tell you, I've got 300 cases. I don't have time to search evidence, to do all the things that you would normally do to prepare for a trial. And so when the prosecutor comes in and says, I've got you for possession, I've got you for possession in a school district, I've got you for, they start stacking these things up. You're facing 20 years. So I tell you what, plead guilty and we'll let you off on time served. And I've talked to so many young kids, young black boys, especially, who take that deal, but don't realize that taking that criminal conviction shuts off a world of options to them.
But they don't have much alternative, do they? They don't have the legal backing to make a defense.
No, but now you go to a system of horrible things are happening in our country. And you know this, piercing the corporate veil, all the things I learned in law school about how hard it is to hold people accountable for some of these, what I consider despicable crimes. Bernie, I went down to Duplin County, North Carolina, where company Smithfield, which has come back into the public eye because of the meat packing, what they're doing to immigrants and to others. They have these vertical integrations. They're doing a type of farming that is a perversion of our heritage. And they create these massive lagoons of pig waste that they spray in low-income communities on fields and loft. I've sat with packed rooms of African Americans telling me they can't open their windows, can't run their air conditioning, their property values have gone down, they have respiratory diseases.
Right.
You know, this Cancer Alley, the companies that are there spewing all of that, that is violence against people.
And how many years in jail do these CEOs get for these crimes?
Zero. Zero.
I'll give you another example. And the point here, folks, what I'm trying to do is George Floyd's murder opens the discussion about justice. What does justice mean? And I think you got to start taking a hard look, as Cory just said, at a very, very two-tier system, where if you are rich and powerful and you can buy a gazillion lawyers behind you, you can essentially do anything you want. You can store the case year after year. You're a large corporation, you Monsanto, some other large corporation. You can stretch that case out until your defendants, the other side, has got to give up.
Very worse than that, you can change the law.
Yeah, you can do that too.
Companies have changed America's jurisprudence to benefit them. Those companies are now people. Those companies have patented biology. I could go through all the laws that they've changed to protect themselves from even being, and you see what's the agenda of Republicans in the Senate right now for if we do another COVID package? It is to grant immunity to corporations if they
top priority right now. Top priority.
Yes. So this is when we talk about violence against Black bodies, you've talked about this, Bernie, that there are 3,000 jurisdictions in America where children have twice the blood lead levels of Flint, Michigan. Who's accountable for that?
That's right.
And so when the number one determination of whether you live around toxic sites, breathe dirty air, drink dirty water is the color of your skin, when a profound indicator of the wealth and economic fragility in your life is the color of your skin, I've heard you say this profoundly, Black family, 1/10 of the wealth of a white family. If the number one indicator of what kind of experience you're going to have with the criminal justice system, I could go through all of this, why people are feeling right now, why people say Black Lives Matter, and not just being beaten by the police, but there's a totality of challenges that are being faced where skin color still in this country will often affect what kind of reality you experience in the country.
Absolutely. That is in healthcare.
Yes.
It is in education. It is in the neighborhood you live in and your proximity to all kinds of toxic waste. Kids in the Bronx, I think, have just in parts of the Bronx have an enormously high rate of asthma. I think 1 out of 4 kids is dealing with asthma. But what I am hoping is that in this momentous time in American history, that from top to bottom, we start thinking about justice. Cory's talking about environmental justice. You know what? People, even if you're poor, have a right to drink water that is not toxic, the right to breathe air that is not going to give you asthma or other types of disease. But when you talk about justice, we're talking about, in my view, I speak for myself here, a concern about a system when 3 people own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. When right now, during the pandemic, unbelievably, billionaires are seeing huge increases in their wealth, while over 30 million people have lost their jobs. So if there's any silver lining to this horrible moment that we are in, the pandemic, the economic collapse, the murder of George Floyd, it is, I hope, that people take a hard look at justice and what kind of society we want to become. Let me ask you something, Cory, going back to jails. Have you had a chance to visit prisons abroad or study at all how other countries deal with imprisonment and
Absolutely, Bernie.
Say a word. How do we differ? I have a story that I'll tell you in a minute. But start off, how do other countries deal with the issues that we're talking about?
So I'm a big fan of a group called the Vera Institute of Justice. They take delegations to look at prisons. They have a delegation, I was not on it, but a survey of the conditions. They don't treat you like animals. They don't dehumanize you. They're letting people wear street clothes to have access to education. The sentences are nowhere near as long as our sentences. They find it aghast the length of time we do here in this country. And their recidivism rates are lower than ours. It's a success story that, compared to ours, which looks, as you said, like a Byzantine era of practices that are torturous, that are about that degrade human potential as opposed to elevating it. I hope people.
I was a number of years ago, Jane and I, when I was in the House, we went on a congressional delegation. I can't remember whether it was Sweden or Denmark. I can't remember. And typically enough, when I had some spare time, instead of doing sightseeing, I wanted to go to their maximum security prison.
I love
My wife will never forgive me. Everybody else is going out seeing the sights.
I know Jane. She enjoyed the trip. I know Jane.
And I took her to a maximum security prison. This is, I wish I could remember, either Denmark or Sweden. This is the truth. Walk in there and I say, well, we made the contacts with the embassy. I'd like to speak to the warden, like to take a look at the prison. And the guy says, well, this is a true story. Before we let you in, we have to talk to the prisoners' union. Really? Okay. And the prisoners' union decided that they would like me to come in. So Jane and I went in there. Okay. We went into a kitchen. This is maximum security. And they have all these, this is where they cook. They have all these huge knives and all kinds of utensils. And I said, what are you in for? Murder? Okay. And bottom line here, they have conjugal visits. And you talk to the officials there, and it's very clear their job is to get this is a men's prison, get these men re-entered into society as productive taxpayers, tax-paying members of the community. That's what they want. It's called rehabilitation. They want them out. They're not there to be punished. They're there to become law-abiding citizens and get out and not come back in. And that is such a different approach than what we do. I remember I was in Iowa. You know Iowa. You've been to Iowa once with High Cory?
Yes, once or twice.
And we had a town meeting on criminal justice. Never forget this. And we had two guys, happened to be African Americans up there. They were describing being in prison. The guy said, well, we talked about recidivism, how people leave prison, get out, and they come back in. And the guy says, well, here's what happened to me. One day I'm in jail and some official comes up to me and says, well, congratulations, you're getting out of jail tomorrow. And here's a check for $75. Good luck. Guy ended up back in jail. Talk a little bit, if you want, about recidivism, about how we are preparing people who are released from jail to become productive members of society and not get back into the same environment they were in, which got them into jail in the first place.
So we have allowed listen to our language. We dehumanize people in order to strip them of any empathy. They're thugs. I can use the language I hear people spoken about, that we put them in prisons and then we do all the things, self-defeating even our societal aims, to hurt them. So the 1994 crime bill stripped Pell Grants from prison because, why would we pay for their education? Well, every dollar spent on education behind bars lowers taxpayer expenses overall $4 because it lowers recidivism rates so dramatically. People that graduate with their BA are far less likely to recidivate. And yet I could show you evidence-based program after evidence-based program that reduces recidivism, reduces societal cults, elevates human potential. But we are not committed to that ethic and that ideal in this country. And you said you're using the word justice. There's a guy I think you know a little bit named Cornel West. You ever hear him?
I do, yes.
I saw him out there for you all the time. He has a saying, what does love look like in public? Justice. And but that word love is really important because it's not sentimentality. It means that I see you. I see your dignity and your worth. And I know what happens to you is directly affects what happened to me. And so we are at a pivot point, I think, Bernie, where we have allowed the low frequency of our caring and love for each other create the conditions necessary for mass incarceration, for torture, for environmental destitution, for lack of health care. We cannot solve these problems at the same frequency of love that they were created. We've got to lift it a lot, which means understanding that the best way to stop public safety is not police. Public safety is healthcare, education, drug treatment, care for people with mental illness.
It's one former mayor to another.
Yes.
Okay. We are asking cops to do much, much more than they are trained or qualified to do. Now, I don't have the statistics in my head. Maybe you do. But no question, there are many people in jail who are clearly mentally ill, that there are people in jail because of addiction, whether it's alcohol addiction, alcoholism, or drug addiction. What particular training does a police officer have to deal with those issues, to deal with the issues of homelessness and other assorted behavioral issues? And I think what you're saying, and I think what more and more people are saying, is we got to get to the root causes of these problems. If we're going to continue to lock up people because they're addicted to heroin or to alcohol, or because they are functionally illiterate, and throw them into jail, that's not really a particularly good solution to that problem. And we can save, as you just indicated, a whole lot of money by putting money into education, into treatment of people who are addicted, into decent housing so that people have an opportunity to grow up with a decent roof over that. And I think you're seeing more and more understanding of that reality.
And so three things that you will understand this as a mayor. I'm a mayor, I go out to Seattle, Plymouth Housing Group, did the study. What's more expensive to Seattle taxpayers? People with mental illness, homeless on the streets, or in supportive housing, which you and I know is expensive. They found out that they saved, for the first 23 people, about $1 million because those folks who are left on the streets end up engaging with police in hospital emergency rooms and jails. So much more expensive. Example number two, to your example. Across the street from me is a drug treatment center. Where I live today in Newark, I walked across the street the first time in Integrity House, sat with the fellas, and they were all telling me their stories. And when I started saying, wait a minute, some of these guys have been arrested dozens of times before they got treatment, costing us as taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars. So much cheaper. We've destroyed their lives, not giving them help. And the last example, going to the first thing you said about the police know this. I'm sitting with the head of the FBI in Newark. I'm a new mayor. Violent crime spiking. We're talking about gangs. He's giving me a lot of intelligence about gang activities in Newark. And I look at him, I go, how do we solve this problem? And he looks at me sort of startled, like the question was stupid. He looks at me and goes, we don't solve this problem. Here was the head of the FBI that knew enforcement was not going to solve this problem. They were just going to treat the symptom of the problem that we as a society are not addressing. And so we can do this, we can continue to do this nightmare of more and more police. We have had presidents stand up and get applause. I'm going to put 1 million more police on the street, as if that is the solution to our problems. And yet at the same time, we're defunding public education. Bernie, this is not this. I don't care if you're right or left on the spectrum. This is not that complicated. If you're just a fiscal conservative about what's the better place to invest in a society, you invest in love, you invest in caring, you invest in healthcare, you invest in education.
And I think what conservatives understand is that it costs something like $60,000 per person to be locked up.
More for a juvenile too.
Oh, is that right?
For kids in prison, it's even higher than that.
And it costs a hell of a lot less to send that person to a state college.
Yes.
And I think conservatives understand that at a time when we're spending $80 billion a year, every year, federal, state, local level, locking up over 2 million people, that if we want to save money, we want to cut the prison population, we've got to invest in our young people, and we can do it.
And I just want to correct you on your number. That's 80 billion for the prison costs, Bernie. It's not the courts, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the police officers who do the arresting. It's not all in cost. It's not the economic damage to that family when those children have lost their breadwinner. And Bernie, I've done this. I remember this place in Newark. We did this big raid, arrested 40 people out of this place where the drugs were being sold. I went in there as a proud elected official that I dealt with the drug crime on the street. And I still remember right before the press conference, I talked to these two children and say, hey, we're doing a press conference. Your mom and dad coming down for this? And they look at me and say, mommy and daddy were arrested last night. And I just remember looking at that and realizing that this was a twisted reality.
Cory, a very significant percentage of those children will be following in their parents' footsteps.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, the system is so corrupt, it is so cruel, it is so immoral that it really is quite unbelievable that we're having this discussion in the year 2020. All right, I think we have, Misty, we got some questions coming in. So if you're up for it, Cory, let me take a look at some of the questions that have come in. Okay. All right, first question is essentially what we've been talking about, but I'll throw it out to you and I'll respond as well. This is from Sierra Dugas, and she writes, do you support defunding the police and rerouting those funds to police alternatives and community safety nets? Why or why not?
Bernie, I think we've just covered that. We should not have a society that is spending this egregious amount of our collective resources on things that are not about restorative justice, which you were talking about the European models, that not are about helping people that are hurt or in states of vulnerability. And so we need a massive investment in the things that will lower the need for policing in our country.
Cory, you know, you've been around the country, I've been around the country. Anything pop into your mind that you could convey to the viewers that's positive, that's inspiring, where we are making some progress?
Well, I mean, this is an area that in my last years as a police officer, as a mayor, I learned a lot about policing, working in hand with the ACLU. But there was John Jay College. We brought them in to Newark and to do an experiment with us that had been working, where you don't go into areas where there's a lot of drug and gang-related violence. You actually do a call in with a commitment that nobody's being arrested, but that you want to have a conversation. Police get it out of the way and let community leaders, the mom on the block that everybody knows, have a conversation with and make offers about, here are the things, we're going to put extra resources for your housing, for job training. Because I used to do this as a mayor. I drive my streets, get out and talk to fellows on the corner, and they would say, we've been looking for jobs. We can't find opportunity. And so there's a lot of innovations, Senator Sanders, going on right now that are showing that you do not need police to achieve safety, that there's different ways about going about it.
Let me give you an example. I was out in LA, I was on Skid Row, you know, where the alcoholics reside. And what they do there, which was pretty impressive, people are not arrested. There is a private group, nonprofit, picks people up, they bring them into a dormitory type setting. People sleep it off. There are counselors there, they get a meal. Ain't a great situation, but it's a lot more humane and cost effective than having the police coming in and arresting people for vagrancy and going through that whole deal. All right.
Bernie, I've taken so many hits back in my early days as a city councilman, supporting needle exchange, safe injection sites, because I follow the data. There are things you can do to save lives, lower our need for police, and elevate human dignity that just are leading with policies of compassion that are about empowering people where they are. And it's a shame that we have answers for everything that we're talking about. I used to say this to my staff when I was mayor. There are best practices all over this country. We want to bring them to our community and show that they can flourish here. This is not a problem of can we, it's a problem of will we. And that's where I want to give the challenge to I'm forgetting her name, Bernie, but to the woman and everybody here. This is a moment where the biggest threat is not a guy in a White House. To me, or the people the man that killed Ahmaud Arbery. The worry for me is good people who are doing nothing in this moment. The bill we just did, Bernie, would not have been possible a month ago. It was the demands of the public. And you know this, Bernie, because you're, I think, 4 or 5 years older than me, man. You know this because you marched in the Civil Rights Movement. I didn't. What came first? The 1964 Civil Rights Bill, the 1965 Civil Rights Bill, or people marching on the streets?
Cory, I've said it a million times.
Yeah.
And what's happening right now is a demonstration of that. Real change. I mean, for many, many years, no disrespect to anybody of our colleagues, people have been talking about some of these issues, went nowhere. Hundreds of thousands of people go out into the streets. Suddenly at the local, state, federal level, people are talking about. And that is how change always comes about. And that's what you talked about. It's a civil rights movement.
Labor movement.
It's the labor movement, the women's movement, the gay movement, you name it. Always, always, always grassroots activism bringing about the change.
What's the old axiom in Washington? Change doesn't come from Washington, it comes to Washington.
I think we can concur with that. All right, here we got a question from Theo Sage. Our question is, can we talk about how we are going to create equity in education and housing for Black communities affected by redlining for the past generation? Well, I suspect it goes beyond the past generation. Redlining, education, housing.
So this is something, I don't know if you know this. So in a lot of states, including New Jersey, there's a woman named Barbara Martinez. She wrote for the Wall Street Journal that kids who live right next to suburban towns could often use fake addresses in those towns because the schools are so much better resourced and whatever. And although surrounding towns often have people that will follow around children, minority children often, and see where they go home. And so this woman, Barbara Martinez, went one town over using like an aunt's address or something to try to get into a school. She gets taken out of class because a private investigator found out. Ironically, a journalism class, couldn't call her parents, was forced to sign a document admitting that she was stealing from the town. This is sort of the realities that still go on, where we have residential segregation, where school funding is often based upon local taxes that creates these savage disparities in
our continued dependency on the property tax.
So these are still things that are very baked in American society, where we are wasting our greatest natural resource, which is the genius of our children, because we're not nurturing genius. As many geniuses are born in Beverly Hills per capita as in Newark per capita. But are we nurturing that genius, our great natural resource, equally? And so the question is right. And let me just give you my one policy plan. We should do this for every question. You and I both give one of our favorite policy plans. So one of my favorite policy plans about rental justice is that we have an earned income tax credit in America that is overwhelmingly subscribed to by people making over $100,000 a year. So it goes to people in the upper echelons of our tax bracket. We should create a renter's tax credit for anybody that's paying over a third of their income in rent. They get a refundable tax credit between their rent and the area median in rental, so that they could afford to live in a lot of area, not being forced, gentrified out of communities. It would actually, this legislation, we studied it, it would take 9 million Americans out of poverty.
Well, you're touching on an issue again, which gets nowhere near the discussion that it requires. I did not know this. I must confess, till I got involved in presidential politics, that this housing crisis, this is from coast to coast.
Everywhere.
You know, I thought, okay, Seattle, I got it. Yeah. San Francisco, I got it. Burlington, Vermont, I got it. You know what? It is all over this country. And it is not just homelessness, which in itself is a disgrace. Got over 500,000 people who are homeless. It is 18 million people, Cory, who are spending half of their incomes on housing. Now, how the hell do you have any money left over to do anything else if half your income is going to housing? And this whole issue of gentrification is wild. because that is driving rents up. It is driving working class people out of the communities in which they grew up, where they wanted to live, they can't afford to live there anymore. So, I grew up in a rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn, New York, 3.5 rooms, and I can't remember what percentage of income in our family we paid for rent, but it was a hell of a lot less than what people are paying right now. And I think what we have to do is figure out a way to tell landlords that the function of housing is not just to maximize your profit. People are entitled to decent, safe, affordable housing at rents they can afford. And my prescription, Cory, is to build some 10 million units of lower income and affordable housing and create God knows how many decent paying jobs, maybe with some of the people in the communities themselves. Imagine kids going to work, building housing in their own communities, what that will mean. So this housing issue is a huge issue. I go a little bit nuts when we talk about education. We're talking about, what are we now, $740 billion for the military. Trump gave his friends $1 trillion in tax breaks a couple of years ago. We have a child care system today, which is a total disgrace, despite everybody knowing that 0 through 4, most important years of human development. Yep. But families can't afford decent quality child care. Workers are earning starvation wages, total disaster. So we got to reprioritize education in America. And that means in a big way, invest in distressed communities so that those kids, you're right, there are geniuses, no more geniuses in Beverly Hills than there are in Newark or Burlington, Vermont, any place else. And we got to give those kids the opportunity to learn. And there's no reason why in this country we don't have the best quality educational system in the world. Not to mention making
full circle, because there's thousands of our schools where there are more police officers in our schools than counselors, healthcare professionals. Right. I mean, we are over policing our schools as well, and starving them of the resources we would need, which would help a lot of children not get unfair discipline.
Now, I know you are familiar with this. I just wonder how many of our viewers are. You got school districts all over this country which are paying starting teachers horrific wages, horrible salaries, when the work that they are doing is some of the most important work in America. We got to attract the best and the brightest into education, into childcare. And what we have got to say, not a radical idea, that to any kid in America and their parents, your kid does well in school, your kid is going to get a college education regardless of the income of your family. All right? To me, that's kind of a no-brainer that you got to invest in our young people for the future of this country. Okay. Here's one from John Andrew. We've got a lot of questions. I'm skipping over some. John writes, do you think the legalization of cannabis would help people of color, and why isn't this taking place? Many POCs are in jails and prisons prisoners of color are in jails and prisons for nonviolent crimes, i.e. cannabis possession. Right, we talked about this a little bit. What would legalizing marijuana, expunging the records of those arrested for marijuana mean for people of color?
Justice. There were more in 2017, last year we have data for, there are more marijuana possession arrests than all the violent crime arrests in America combined. And again, they're arresting POCs, people of color. They're not arresting folks of privilege, of greater privilege.
And by the way, that's an expensive proposition too, right? You got to arrest a lot of people, you got to take them to court.
Very expensive, and it's for ridiculous. This demonization of marijuana, the prohibition of marijuana is ridiculous.
You know, I was at events that we had, one of the stock things that I would do is I'd say to the crowd of thousands of people, I'd say, raise your hand if you or anybody you know has ever been arrested for possession of marijuana. I was astounded. I was astounded by the hands that went up.
Yes.
And, you know, and then if you get a criminal record, as you discussed earlier, all right?
Yes.
You're going out and you're getting a job. You're looking for a job.
Yes.
And the boss says, have you ever been arrested? Well, yeah, I have been. Okay, well, thank you. We'll interview somebody else. Okay.
Did you raise your hand, Bernie, when you asked?
I did not.
Okay.
I did not. Here's a question from Naaman Rosen. Is there a fear of policing becoming a privatized industry?
Well, we privatize prisons, Bernie. You and I both know that, and that's a form of law enforcement, which is you and I are both morally against the privatization of prisons
and detention centers
and detention facilities. I don't know. I don't know in New Jersey, at least, if there are people moving towards the privatization of police. But again, as you and I talked about earlier in the story of Rosario, is the police often are working for large moneyed interests in ways they're not being employed to work for the defense of the vulnerable and the weak, or equipped or trained to do the kind of things we want to see them.
There are many reasons why we should not have privatized prisons and detention centers. But one of the main reasons is these guys make more money by having more people in their facilities. So their job in one way or another is to bring more people in. They aggressively lobby against efforts to lower the prison population because they lose money. So you and I have long been in agreement that we've got to get rid of private prisons and detention centers. Here's a fairly fundamental question, and maybe Cory will end up on this one, because I think it's a very, very basic and good question. Abigail Alter, right? Bernie, what do you have to say to those who have lost all faith in the U.S. government? Well, let me throw it to you, Cory. I'll answer it as well. There's no question that there is an enormous amount of demoralization among people who have given up believing that the United States government represents their interests. That's all. You know, I was on the floor today, and the point that I was making touches on this issue. And that is, right now, at this moment, we're looking at three major crises. And that is the pandemic. Haven't had something like this in 100 years. Talking about the economic meltdown, over 30 million people losing their jobs. And we're talking about people going out into the streets to demand racial justice in America. Three simultaneous issues. And you tell me, Cory, you're a fellow United States Senator. What are we doing in the United States Senate to say to the American people, we are going to respond to the pandemic. We're going to respond to 30 million people losing their jobs and people going hungry. We're going to respond to the issue of racial injustice. We're going to be working night and day on this. What's going on in the Senate?
Well, Bernie, can I answer that person's question? Because I hear it a lot, where people have this understandable desire to give up faith in American government or America. And I just want to remind those folks that, you know, George Floyd's family haven't given up. Emmett Till's mother, she didn't give up. The mothers of the movement, who you know, Bernie, you've met them along the campaign trail. These were moms of people that have been murdered by police. They didn't give up. They in fact, the Charleston murders of Mother Emanuel, they didn't give up. There's an alchemy out there that's beyond my spiritual power of people who face the most wretched, darkest, painful corners of this country. And they didn't yet give up. They somehow transformed that darkness into grit and guts and willingness to keep fighting and never giving up. And so we don't have the luxury right now to give up on this country. What a point of privilege where you can just say, I'm done. There's a lot of people who What happens or not is a matter of life or death. They have no choice but to fight for this country, to save the soul of this nation. We are here because the Ella Bakers, the Fred Shuttlesworth, the Dorothea Cottons. I can go through all these grassroots activists who never gave up, even though they had every right to, facing horrors that we ourselves are not facing. So I'm sorry, you can't give up. There's been too much suffering and sacrifice and struggle to give up. And we know ultimately, and we're seeing it right now, not enough people are on the streets. But yet still, the people who are protesting right now, who are artists of activism, they've already moved the needle in Washington, not nearly as far as it needs to go. But just imagine if we were able to get more people woke off the sidelines to stop treating this democracy like a spectator sport. And so I just want to say to the person, please, please don't stop fighting. There are too many people that are depending on what you do today, tomorrow, this week, this next 150 days until the next election and beyond.
And I would just add to that, I agree with what you said. I would just add to that, what's the alternative? Really? Because it's not just about you, it's about your children, it's about your grandchildren, future generations. It's about the future of the planet. Yeah, you want to give up? Good. Then we'll destroy the planet through climate change. And what then? So I think, Cory's point is fundamentally right. We are living on the shoulders of giants. People whose names we don't even know. People who were lynched, people who were beaten, people who were incarcerated. Not famous people, but people in every walks of life. People who fought to form a union so workers could live with some degree of dignity. People who fought for the most fundamental civil rights, the right to vote, the right to end all forms of discrimination, the right for women to vote, the right for women to get jobs and an education, for gay rights, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So I know, Cory knows, there are a lot of people who feel discouraged, especially with the person we have in the White House today. But we would be fulfilling a fool's errand if we allowed Trump to demoralize us and to discourage us from being involved in the political process. Quite the contrary. Our job now is A, to defeat Trump, who in every sense of the word is the most dangerous president in the modern history of this country, maybe in the history of this country, and B, continue the struggles for justice, for racial justice, for immigration justice, for economic justice. We should not have half of our people living paycheck to paycheck. For healthcare justice, only major country on earth not to guarantee healthcare to all people. For education justice, so that we have the best education system in the world available to all, regardless of income. Not radical stuff. This is not radical stuff. This is called justice, decency, dignity. So we got a lot of work in front of us, but despair and giving up is not an option. We've got to keep going forward. And I just want to thank Senator Cory Booker for the great work he is doing in so many areas, and thank him very much for being with us. Cory?
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Bernie.
Good night, everybody.